Some people do not read the Old Testament because they think that God is mean and angry. So they opt for the New Testament, where Jesus seems so loving and kind. But what we're going to learn today is that the Bible is actually one big book that can't really be separated between the Old and the New, because it's all about one big rescue story and how Jesus comes to this earth to save us from our sins. So today we're going to see how Jesus himself points to himself in the Old Testament. Join us today as we continue with our Puzzled by the Bible series. All right, good morning. Welcome. If you are new today, we are very, very glad you're joining us. And we are working through a new series called Puzzled by the Bible. And we're doing this because we think that a lot of times, like, Christians don't read their Bibles. And I think a lot of it's because they don't understand it. The Bible seems very daunting and very puzzling and very confusing. And so we want to change that. And so what we decided to do is we've been working through Romans and the Gospel of John, and we decided to take a 16-week break. And what we're doing is we're talking all about the Bible, so you will be excited to read it once you understand it even more. And then when we come back in January, we'll pick back up with Romans and the Gospel of John. So before we start, last week I shared with you that one of our daughters is, pregnant, Cheyenne, those of you that know Cheyenne, and she's going to have little baby Goldie in, about 4 weeks, I think it is. But Cheyenne already has a 2-year-old, Susie, and Susie is cute and really strong-willed, okay? So Cheyenne's like, Mom, I'm so worried that Susie's going to be mean to Goldie when she gets here. So she sent me this Instagram, and it made her feel a little bit better.
Who is that?
Don't poke her.
Is that Scotty? Be gentle.
Yep, that's going to be Susie with Goldie, okay? So there you go. That's what she was all worried about. All right. Now, back to Bible study. So far, we gave you the first lesson. We did an overview. Then we spent an entire week on what the Old Testament's about. Last week, we talked about the New Testament and why we can be assured that the books that are in the New Testament are the right ones. And today, we're going to kind of go a different direction, and we're going to see what the Bible is all about. We say this, the Bible is the greatest rescue of all time. And it's all the way from Genesis, all the way to, when Jesus shows up, it's Jesus coming to this earth to reconcile us back to a relationship with God. That's what the whole Bible is about. And he does that by dying on a cross for sin, rising from the dead, and that just proved who he was. But that isn't just in the New Testament, and we tend to think it is. But what we're going to see today is that Jesus is in both the New Testament and the Old Testament. Now, some people don't like to read the Old Testament because they think this is God. They think he's angry and he's mean. He just kills people all the time, and that's actually not true, but that's what people think. And so they opt for this. There's Jesus, and he's nice and hugging the lambs. Although I don't think there's a verse that says Jesus hugs lambs. Okay, but he brings this message of love and he heals people. So people opt for that. So speaking of healing, I'll have to tell you my cute little joke. There's a 4th grader. He celebrated his birthday on crutches because he broke his foot. So he couldn't carry his birthday cupcakes to school without help. So the mom asked the older brother, the 6th grader, Noah, to help his brother carry the cupcakes. And Noah said, well, I could, but I would prefer not to. And this was a teaching moment. The mom goes, what is wrong with you? Like, what would Jesus do? And Noah said, well, Jesus would heal him so he could carry his own cupcakes. I was like, that's kind of a good point. All right, but what we need to know is that the Old Testament and the New Testament fit together like a puzzle. You can't have the full picture if you don't have all the puzzle pieces. And this Instagram video, you're not going to understand it until you see it, and then I'll explain what it means between the Old and New Testament. So here you go. When you are forced to be in the family picture. That cat hates those dogs, okay? Now, the reason why I showed that to you is because we tend to separate the Old Testament and New Testament to cats and dogs. We tend to think the Old Testament is like the 3 dogs, and that's all the people in the Old Testament, and Jesus just shows up as a cat in the New Testament. But what we're seeing is this is one big family photo, and Jesus is throughout the Old and the New Testament. So let's start here and talk about this, because you can't have the Old Testament you can't have the New Testament without the Old Testament. Here's why. Without the Old Testament, Jesus wouldn't make sense. Now, really think that through, because we wouldn't know we had a sin problem or where sin even began if we didn't read the Old Testament. If there was never, Genesis with the story of Adam and Eve and sin and how the world became corrupt, and if we didn't know that in Genesis, we would be confused when Jesus showed up and says, hey, I'm going to die for your sin. You're going to be like, what sin? Because we didn't know that. So the Old Testament tells us that. We wouldn't understand the concept of paying for sin with animal blood sacrifices if we didn't read the Old Testament first. Now think about that. Moses comes along, God gives him the law, and in the law you have all of this whole sacrificial system. And back then, he was saying, in order to pay for your sin, it would take, you kill a lamb, you kill a dove. The blood of the animal is what would cover your sin. So then Jesus comes along and he's like, I'm dying on a cross to pay for your sin. If we didn't have an Old Testament, we wouldn't even understand that. We'd be like, what do you mean blood is covering sin? That makes no sense. But that's why we read the Old Testament. It gives us context for what the New Testament tells us. Then we have this. We wouldn't understand why Jesus' genealogy mattered if we had never read the Old Testament about God building the nation of Israel through Abraham, where Jesus' lineage come from. So if you just open the Bible at Matthew, never read the Old Testament, and Matthew says, the genealogy of Jesus, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and you would be like, who are these guys? But the Old Testament gives us context because this is where God says, I'm building a nation through Abraham, and through his lineage would come Jesus. So this is why they both have to go together. Mark Zook, he was a missionary to the Mauk tribe in Papua New Guinea, and he had to first go there and learn the language before he could even tell people about Jesus. But he said something, and I thought this was really fascinating. Watch this.
Well, a day does come, though, when you do know enough of their language and how they think to explain to them the Word of God. Now, the question is this: where do you start? The Bible is a big book, and none of these Mauk tribal people had any previous exposure to God's Word.
Before we could start teaching, we had to prepare Bible lessons. Our tribal language helper, who was not a believer at that time, was the key to getting the proper Bible terminology we needed. Even before we started to teach, the Mauk seemed to sense a wonderful message was coming. When the teaching finally started, the entire village of 310 people gathered. We never mentioned Jesus Christ until after 2 months of teaching Old Testament foundational stories.
Isn't that fascinating? Like, who would have thought that? I would never have thought to do that. But then it dawned on me, the Old Testament reveals to us why Jesus needed to come to earth and die for our sin. Like you have to have the Old Testament basis in order to understand Jesus. All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to see Jesus in the Old Testament through prophecy, typology, things like that. And then next week, we're going to talk about how Jesus literally steps out of heaven, and he's called the angel of the Lord. There's Christophanies, there's times when someone shows up, and yet when you put all the pieces together, the only option it could be would be a pre-incarnate Jesus before he actually comes to earth. We'll talk all about that next week. It's really fascinating. So let's start here with a Mike Winger clip about Jesus in the Old Testament, because he did a 23-part series on this. If you want to know more about this, he literally did 23 hours on it. Everything in the Old Testament is that has Jesus in it, he found it. So, but this is kind of fun.
Let me explain to you what we're doing. We're about to start a new series, something I'm very excited about doing, even though I'm not entirely sure how it's going to play out as we kind of unpack it and go through it. The series is going to be on the topic of how to find Jesus in the Old Testament. That's like the easy to grasp title. A more fancy title would be the theology of typology. And what we're going to do is we're going to tackle this issue of Jesus in the Old Testament. That is, God purposefully and deliberately placing content in the Old Testament that was meant to be clear and even sometimes unclear pictures of Jesus, analogies of Jesus, appearances, theophanies, that sort of thing, all of the above, teaching that's related to him in some way, that this is throughout the Old Testament. And I think this is a very exciting thing to study. I think there's something about it that just ministers to our spirit. Like when you're getting to Jesus in the Old Testament, there's something very exciting about it. It's also, I think, neglected. I think that we tend to not do this very much. And when you think about it, you're like, yeah, I'll study a whole book of the Old Testament and not necessarily be thinking that much about this issue. Or maybe not be equipped with the ability to think very well about the issue. Like, I don't know, how am I supposed to do this? How do I know I'm not just making stuff up? I'm not just like finding Jesus, right? The way I discover like an imaginary friend. Like, how do I know I'm not doing that? And so I want to talk about that as well. Because this is also, not only is it exciting and neglected, it's also a little dangerous. Because in a sense, we're almost telling people, I don't think I'm going to do this, but we're almost telling people read between the lines. And I've heard people say some interesting things. And sometimes I heard one person put it this way, sometimes you're thinking, when they go to the Old Testament, they find some passage where it's referencing Jesus, at least in their opinion, and you think to yourself, is my pastor on to something? Or is my pastor on something? because I'm like going, I don't know about that, buddy. So one of the things I want to do is I want to look at, for instance, are there rules in Scripture for how we find Jesus in Scripture? That's one of the things we'll look at as we go on this series that'll last several weeks. So let me give you kind of a brief overview, since this is the first in this series. I don't like introductions. I just like jumping right into content. But I'm going to give you the brief overview today and make a couple important points so we can get started right. Today we're going to lay foundations. We're just going to establish the fact that it is, in fact, a New Testament teaching that Jesus is throughout the Old Testament in pictures and types and all sorts of different ways, even allegories.
So that's where we're going to go. Crystal, all your girls have been waiting for you over here, so you're welcome to come and sit down over here. Just so you know that, like, it's been kind of sad. We had to do the drawing without you this morning. Somebody else had to be you. So, but yeah, you're welcome to come sit with your group. Now that I just made you so embarrassed, but yay. But here's the deal. When we talk about this whole idea of Jesus in the Old Testament, we're not going to just be pulling verses out and trying to make them Jesus. That's not what we're doing. It is Jesus. There's not going to be any question in your mind once we get to it. Now, what's amazing to me is how a lot of Jewish people are coming to know Jesus because they're learning what we're going to learn today. They are suddenly realizing that Jesus is all through the Old Testament. So, watch this.
And my mom became a follower of Yeshua, follower of Jesus, a few years before that.
How'd that happen?
It happens before that in USSR. She met some Christians, and actually she was exposed to something very interesting about the teaching about Yeshua from the New Testament.
Yeah.
And it's connected somehow for her to the Old Testament.
Yes.
And this was the very interesting point for me, because it sounds something very strange. How Jesus connected to Judaism, how he connected to Old Testament.
Yeah.
And then I came and asked her, so Mom, why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you believe in Yeshua and Yeshua?
Yeah.
It's not the Jewish way. And she smiled and said, no, but he appeared in the Old Testament. He came from there and through all the prophecies, and I was surprised. So at that moment, I started meeting with a Jewish person, Messianic Jew named Michael, and he came to meet with me, and he opened the Bible and said, okay, now you're going to share with me from the New Testament, correct? He said, no, let's start from Genesis. I sat there and said, are you sure it's a Genesis? You know, the first Bereshit, you know, the first book of the Bible?
Let's go into
he
this
said, yes. Oh, thanks.
Skilding.
And it was something very surprising for me, because, you know, to open Genesis with the Christian guy, who I thought he never read it before,
Yeah.
and he started going with me through the prophecies from Genesis to Malachi, and to show me that it's there.
Yeah.
It speaks about the Messiah. It speaks
Yes.
about Yeshua, and I was surprised. I was totally shocked by this.
And I think most people are. Some of you may have gone to church all your life and you're like, what do you mean Jesus is in the Old Testament? So we're going to work through that today and next week. So today, as we start seeing this, suddenly we're going to begin to realize this, that Jesus isn't just some guy who was born in Bethlehem and died on the cross for sin. Like, that's just not how this whole thing played out. What we're going to find out is the Old Testament is all about Jesus. Jesus says so himself. So he links himself to the Old Testament, and because his issue became with the people that were Jewish, the people that were, they should have known their scriptures. When we talk about the Old Testament scriptures, this is the scriptures that, that we say is our Old Testament, but the Jews should have known everything in there. And if they did, they would have understood that Jesus really was the Messiah, that he fulfilled all these prophecies. But they didn't. My fear is this. I think so many Jews missed Jesus' first coming because of their lack of knowledge about the Old Testament scriptures. When Jesus showed up, half of them didn't know enough to even know that this was him. But I think for us today, here's my fear. I think because so many people don't read the New or Old Testament, they will be shocked at his second coming. We talk a lot about this. Jesus is coming back. And so what I want to do is I want to show you a portion in the Old Testament that shows about Jesus when he returns. And everything revolves around this particular phrase, Son of Man. Because Jesus talks about this. When Jesus talks about end times, look at Matthew 24. His disciples come to him and they're like, okay, what's going on? What's going to happen in the end times? And this is what Jesus says. Now look at what he says. He'll use the word Son of Man. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. At this point, the Jewish people are going to be like, oh my gosh, how did we miss this? They will see the Son of Man arriving on the clouds of heaven with the power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet blast, and they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other. Now, we always say verse 31 is most likely the rapture. A lot of people don't like to think that, but I think Jesus just makes that clear right there, and it's after, it's towards the end of the 7 years, not at the beginning. So that's kind of a fascinating thing. But I want you to see the word Son of Man. And so when Jesus says this, but if you didn't know your Old Testament scriptures, you would be like, I don't even know who they're talking about. Who is this Son of Man? And what we're going to see is, back here, this is our Old Testament, major prophets, and then you see Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then I squared out Daniel. Daniel is where you first see this word, Son of Man, in relation to the return of Jesus. So I'll show you that in a minute, but first I want to play you a video. John Rich, for those of you that like country western music, John Rich, he's pretty much taking a stand for his faith in Jesus now. And so Tucker Carlson interviewed him. I think we played a clip a while back. I just can't remember which one. He just released a video called Revelation. I'll play that in a minute here. And it's all about the return of Jesus. But I love when John Rich talks to Tucker Carlson, he tells him about the return of Jesus. But he takes him he says, it goes all the way back to the book of Daniel. So watch this. I love how Tucker laughs. He makes me laugh.
But when you said you'd written a song about Revelation, I was like, well, it's a legitimate book of the Bible, but it's the one that preachers don't teach, that no one really wants to read. And I'm thinking, that's so great. I couldn't wait to talk to you about it. But yeah, I didn't think that anyone
it's an uncomfortable
would
book.
Want to hear about it. So tell the story, like I've never heard of anybody doing something like that.
Right.
First of all, what is Revelation?
Revelation was written by the Apostle John at the end of his life, when he was basically a castaway at that point, and he started receiving visions and prophecies, and he wrote down what he saw. And a lot of what he saw, you got to remember, he only had his life experiences to try to describe what it was that he was seeing in these prophecies.
He was on an island, as I recall.
Yeah, Isle of Patmos. Yeah, and so he was writing this out as it was coming. Can you imagine what he must have felt like? No. What is that? What is that? Like, he's seeing all these things that are going to happen thousands of years in the future, and he's trying to describe it to us in the terms that he was familiar with. So, I mean, the book is absolutely incredible, and it's not just Revelation. Revelation ties back into Daniel, which was around thousands of years before John.
Yes.
It also ties into Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2 and 1 Corinthians and a lot of other places. People think that the whole end times discussion only resides in the book of Revelation, but that's not true.
So
It's been
the book of
spoken about
Revelation
throughout.
tells the story of the end of history. That's my read.
Tells the story about the return of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
It says it's telling you what is going to happen prior to him coming back and what's going to happen after he comes back. Lays it out.
So how did you decide to write a song about a book of the Bible that most Christian preachers don't want to talk about?
I did not decide to write this song.
Huh.
Because first of all, how do you sing what's in Revelation? I mean, think about it, you know. Last November, I'm at my house in Nashville. I was not thinking about writing a song about anything. And out of nowhere, it felt like a hammer hit me in the back of the head. Boom, like that. Like, what is this? What is going on? What's this feeling? And this melody and these lyrics. Oh, Revelation, I can feel it coming like a dark train running. Oh, get ready because the king is coming. The king is coming back again. I'm talking like that. And I went,
where were you?
Okay. I was at home in Nashville.
Just sitting in your living room?
Just chilling out. And I said, okay, I hear you. I grabbed a guitar off the wall, a pencil, a notebook, went and sat in a quiet room in the house. And in about 60 minutes, the entire song had come out.
There you go. Now, I loved how he brought it back to the book of Daniel. So let's talk about the Son of Man, and let's see what Daniel says about what John Rich is talking about. If you look at Daniel 7:13, Daniel is having this vision of, like he said, what's going to happen thousands of years in the future. That's what a prophecy is. It's like something that's going to happen. Daniel 7 says this. He says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man. So if you were Jewish and Jesus said, I'm the Son of Man, you would have to go, oh, this is who they're talking about. Was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, Jesus, the Son of Man, was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. And we know this hasn't happened yet, so that's why we know this prophecy has not been fulfilled yet. But Daniel has told us what this is going to look like. It says, his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Now, I love this because so many people, like, we're on this earth and we're living for today, and we just think this is all there is. And yet you read the Bible and you're like, wait a minute, there is an everlasting kingdom. That you want to be on the right side of this. That's why you need to know Jesus, so you can be in that kingdom, because the other place isn't going to be that great. So, in the Old Testament, it says the Son of Man, and so then people are asking Jesus when he gets here. They're asking, like, who are you? And so we see what he says in Mark 14:61. They were asking him, the leaders were like, who are you? But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am, and here you go, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Like, he just goes back and says, when Daniel was talking about the Son of Man in the Old Testament, that is me. And he ties it all together. If you look at Psalm 110, Daniel 7:13, it all ties back to what Jesus just said. Now, the Son of Man in Daniel in the Old Testament is Jesus, who is going to come back and rule and reign. But here's what we need to know for right now. For the moment, there is a spiritual battle going on in the spiritual realm for our souls. If you are not a Christian, then Satan is battling in a realm, a spiritual realm that you cannot see for your soul. And he's going to put everything in your path so that you don't want to come to Jesus, because that's what Satan does. But we see this in Daniel chapter 10. There's someone in Daniel 10 called Michael the Archangel, and he's actually one that he's a warrior, and he battles in this spiritual realm, and he contends and he fights, and he's standing against all the evil spirits and principalities, and that's who we see in John Rich's video in Revelation. So I'm going to play this, and what I want you to see is that the guy in white that has wings is Michael the Archangel, and he's battling Satan. And John Rich wrote this song because he realized that he was from the country western scene, and people are living for everything but Jesus. And so this song came to him so heavily, and here it is.
Dancing in the flames, the people cursed his name, bowed at the altar of the father of lies. But there's a number to their days and all their evil ways. The Lord's gonna turn away from all their cries. Oh, revelation, I can feel it coming like a dark train running. Oh, get ready, 'cause the King is coming. The King is coming back again. Brimstone upon their heads, millstones around their necks. They'll feel the shaking when the trumpet sounds. And no matter where they hide, there'll be nowhere to run when Jesus puts his mighty foot on the ground. Oh, revelation, I can feel it coming like a dark train running. Oh, get ready, 'cause the King is coming. The King is coming back again. Like a lightning flash, their voice will wail and their teeth will gnash. And he'll set fire to the evil ones and all the wickedness they've done. There'll be no time to turn around as the stars begin to hit the ground and the mountains fall and the veil is torn with the sound of that seventh horn. Oh, revelation, I can feel it coming like a dark train running. Before his days were done, the King is coming, and it won't be long.
Amen. There you go. The King is coming, and we know that. Isn't that awesome? I know. I was super impressed with that. But anyway, my whole point to even showing you all of this is that Jesus is tied to the Old Testament. And that's how we know that Jesus is coming and going to rule and reign, because Daniel talks about the Son of Man. Now, before Jesus comes back, the Son of Man must die for sin. You're like, okay, well, where do you see that? Well, here you go, Matthew 20:28. Just as the Son of Man, same one that was in Daniel, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And then we see that the Son of Man forgives. Look at Matthew 9:6. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sin. So you kind of start seeing when you're in the Old Testament and you see something and it's like, oh, wait a minute, Jesus says the same thing. Now, I want to show you today how Jesus himself says this. Look at the Old Testament. It's ultimately all about me. Now, Jesus had a problem with the religious Jews of the time. When Jesus was talking to the Jews, he tried to explain this to them. John 5:39. He said, you study the scriptures. Now remember, that's the Old Testament scriptures. The New Testament hasn't been written yet. The only thing they had to go off of was the Old Testament. He said, you study the scriptures thoroughly because you think in them you possess eternal life. But it is these scriptures that testify about me. Jesus is like the Old Testament these are the words of Jesus himself. And then he says, but you are not willing to come to me so that you may have life. And the Jews didn't want to come to Jesus because if they did, they would have to give up their pride. They would have to give up their synagogues. They would have to give up their, I'm so spiritual, I'm so religious. They would have to give up all of those things to follow Jesus, and they didn't want to. And I think the same is true today. We have the Bible, God's words, the very words of God to us, and we have to make a decision. If Jesus is who he says he is, and when you see this big picture of Old and New Testament over thousands and thousands of years with one theme running through it, then I think our only response is to say, okay, I give. I'm surrendering my life to you. But always know this, there's a cost to that. And that's why a lot of people don't want to follow Jesus. Because here's what the cost is. We have to stop seeking our own personal kingdoms, and Jesus says we must now seek his kingdom. And I think John Rich is feeling that pain right now. He was like, I was seeking my own kingdom, and I was in the country scene, and I was writing all this music and making a lot of money. And then one day he's like, you know what? Now it's got to be all about Jesus. And he walked away from the country music scene. It was kind of interesting. But I love like last week's video with Beckett Cook, where when he gave his life to Jesus, everything changed. And that's what happens when a person truly is born again and comes to Jesus. But for the Jews, very few were willing to do that. But then Jesus is going to do something. Jesus steps up and rocks their world and uses their scriptures to point them to him. So watch how he does this. Jesus lived in Nazareth. It was customary for a Jew to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and in the synagogues, the Jewish men, someone would get up and read a portion of the Old Testament. So they would pull something like from Genesis or Joshua or Isaiah or one of those, and then they would get up and they would just read the Old Testament scriptures. So at this particular week, look what happens. Luke 4:16, Jesus is now in Nazareth, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and he stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Now, Isaiah is under one of the major prophets in our Old Testament. He's the first one there. So they have a copy of the book of Isaiah from the Old Testament, and this is what Jesus does. He opened the book and he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." I'll just read Isaiah 61 and you'll see a lot of this there. And Jesus, remember, like I said, no New Testament, so Jesus is reading the Old Testament, and he sits down, and look what he says. And he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, sat down, and the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were on him. And then Jesus says this, and he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus just told everyone that what I just read about, I came to preach the gospel, I came to proclaim release to captives, that is me. And you can find that in your Old Testament scripture. Jesus is like delivering this amazing message. Now, speaking of delivery, I'll have to tell you a cute joke. There was an owner of a small New York sandwich deli. He was being questioned by the IRS. The IRS, he had made $80,000 that year, and the IRS agent, came to him and was like, "We have a problem." And the deli owner was like, why do you have a problem with me? Like, we work, 362 days a year. All of our family works really hard. Like, what's the problem here? And he said, well, it's not that you made $80,000. It's your expenses. Like, you listed 6 trips to Florida for you and your wife, like from New York to Florida. And you can't do that. And he's like, oh, but you don't understand. He goes, that's a legitimate business expense because we also deliver. All the way to Florida. And I'm like, okay, there you go. All right, back to John. John 5, Jesus tries to explain who he is by bringing up the one man that the Jews revere. And this is Moses. Look what Jesus says, John 5:46. He said, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me." Why? Because he wrote about me. Now, really think that through. What did Moses write? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5, the Torah. And Jesus is like, everything he wrote in that is about me. And you can start seeing it if you start, reading these books. You're like, wait a minute. I think this is foreshadowing, like the law, the sacrificial system. All this stuff points to Jesus. And so what Jesus is telling them is, you should be able to see this. If you read Moses, you can understand who I am going to be. Now, let's look at what Jesus says in Luke 24. At this particular time, Jesus has died on a cross. He rose from the dead. Everyone's confused. Like, everyone is confused, even his disciples. It's the morning of. They don't know what to do with this. And I always wonder about this, because I'm like, Jesus made it very clear to his disciples that he would die and rise from the dead. Look at this in Mark 9:31. And here we see the Son of Man again. He says, "For he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." He told them exactly what was going to happen. But they didn't understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him because it wouldn't make sense. Like, what do you mean you're going to die? And it made no sense until it happened. So that morning, Jesus rises from the dead. 2 of his disciples are walking, and they're having this conversation about what just happened. Look at Luke 24. That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. You're like, what? Jesus just walks up to these 2 guys walking on the road to Emmaus. But look at verse 16. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus is there with them, but they don't recognize him. It's like they have these blinders on their eye, and they can't see. So Mike Winger is going to help us understand that, and I put the rest of Luke 24 that he's going to go over. So watch this.
Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus draws near, he's resurrected, and their eyes can't see him. It doesn't say he was unrecognizable physically, it says their eyes couldn't. So the problem's with their eyes, as though God supernaturally kept them from understanding who they were looking at. Keep that in mind. Verse 17, "And he said to them, 'What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back, saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women said, but him they did not see.'" So they recount the story as it was at the moment, right? And so you're right there in the moment. Verse 25, "And he said to them, 'O foolish ones, O foolish ones.'" And he rebukes them. Listen to the rebuke. It's really interesting. "And slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." Slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. He doesn't just say that they were foolish for not believing the report of the women. In a sense, he does this with Thomas. When Thomas doesn't believe the report of the other disciples and the women. But in here, he highlights a different issue. He says, slow in heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Now, maybe not everything was clear, but there are very clear statements in Scripture about the coming Messiah who will suffer and die, along with the coming Messiah who will rule and reign. That there was a minority group, even at the time, of Jewish leadership or Jewish thinkers who thought maybe there's 2 Messiahs, one suffers and dies and one rules and reigns, because it was hard for them to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Oh, they were ready for the ruling and reigning. God, I'm ready for heaven, but I don't know if I'm ready for what it takes to get there. You know, I'm ready for glory. I'm just not ready for the gory of life that comes oftentimes before that. And so in the same sense, it's like they didn't believe everything that was written.
I love that. He says, you don't believe the prophets in the Old Testament. So that's why we're trying to say Jesus is throughout all of the Old Testament. So let's follow the trail. So verse 26 says this, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? So it's like, all right, where is that in the Old Testament? Well, here you go. About 580 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Think about that. 580 years before Jesus even shows up, the Holy Spirit inspired King David to write Psalm 22:1. Look at this. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, that should ring a bell, because that's what Jesus said on the cross. My God, and he quotes all the way back to Psalm 22. He says, far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within me. Now remember, this is 580 years before. Look at this. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and feet. All the way back in Psalm, 580 years before. And David's writing this inspired by who? God himself. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for clothing they cast lots. Now, if you read the story of Jesus when he died on the cross, that's exactly what they did. How did David know this 580 years before this even happened? This is what we're saying. Jesus is all through the Old Testament. Let's look at Isaiah. This is 700 years before Jesus. Isaiah, one of the major prophets, in the Old Testament, he writes this. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. It's all over the Old Testament. These glimpses of Jesus all through. So when Jesus showed up and all of these things, they should have been like, oh my gosh, I remember Psalm, I remember Isaiah, I remember this. This is the Messiah. But they didn't. So Jesus continues teaching the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. But look what Jesus did. He says this, beginning with Moses, all the way back in Genesis, and all the prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, he interpreted to them all the scriptures of the things concerning himself. Jesus himself tells these two, I am all over the Old Testament. And he shares with them all the places that he is so that they can connect the Old Testament with who Jesus is. Now, remember, we say this, the New Testament hadn't been written yet. They had nothing to go on except the Old Testament. That was it. How would you know if this was Jesus or not? You better study the Old Testament. Now, it's getting late, so Jesus asked them, they asked Jesus to stay with them. Luke 24:30. When he had reclined at the table with them, he took bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And you're like, okay, what? That would have just been so weird. But it's almost like the spiritual blinders came off and suddenly they could see Jesus. And I think for someone who doesn't know Christ, I think that's what you need to pray for. God, take the spiritual blinders off of my life so I can see you. But look what they said in verse 22. They said to one another, were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scripture to us? The disciples' hearts were burning. Why? Because the living, breathing, inspired Word of God connected with their hearts and their souls. Now, the reason why I'm making a big deal about this is because I want to remind you, because we talk a lot about Mormonism in here, mostly because I have cousins, my whole side of my family that are Mormons, and my Mormon cousin one time sent me a Book of Mormon and said, you need to pray and ask God and, see if there's this, feeling in your chest or bosom. I think they call it the burning in my bosom or whatever. And if you do, that means that the Book of Mormon's true. And I was so shocked. I'm like, okay, no, the Bible's true. Like, I don't need anything else, but that's what they do. And so what I want to tell you is this, that the only true burning in our hearts comes from reading the Bible, the only book God takes credit for writing. If someone comes to you and says, you need to read this, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the whatever, and it's not the Bible, and they're like, just see how you feel. No, you don't see how you feel. This is not about a feeling. This is about saying the Bible, the Word of God, is my final authority. That's the only thing. We have someone right now that's literally gone off the rails. He got online. He is involved with this weird cult. He knew the Bible, and now he's gone into this particular direction. He's believing things that aren't true because he hasn't made the Bible his final authority. And so that's what I'm saying. If someone says something to you, make sure that the Bible says that. Because anything else comes from Satan. Satan says this, Paul says this, no wonder for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And you need to remember that. Like something that looks so good, but it could be Satan behind it. All right, let's look at Matthew, see Jesus in the Old Testament. Let's talk about when Mary gets pregnant with Jesus. Now, speaking of children, I wonder what kind of a mother that Mary was to Jesus. And this made me laugh because this is how we think we're going to be when we have kids, and yet this is also what we actually look like. Watch this.
White dresses with blue satin sashes, snowflakes that stay on my nose and eyelashes.
Listen to me. Furniture. Stop talking. Shut up and listen. Sit. I don't want to hear noise. Don't want to hear you.
I'm serious. Died laughing. And then when you have kids, you realize that they're kind of brats. And then they put you in weird, uncomfortable positions. Watch this.
Can I just get an iced coffee, please?
Can I get cookies?
We have cookies at home.
We have coffee.
Can I have some cookies also, please?
Can I also have some So you're just like, okay, this is kids. And they're just kind of all brats. So there you go. Now, Joseph is going to divorce Mary, and I'm not really sure how this is. I have a really funny video to show you, but it's kind of long, so I'm not sure if I should or not. Okay. I don't know. Should I do it? Okay. All right. You're like, we're tired of just the exhausting Old Testament. Okay, so here is, so Joseph is going to divorce Mary, because remember, the divorce and marriage was different back then. Not sure how he was going to tell her or what kind of tone he was going to use. So we're going to show a Skit Guys video on how, if you how you talk to your spouse, you might want to rethink it. Okay, watch it.
Hey, did you pay the cable bill today?
No.
Didn't you have a lunch break today?
Welcome to That's So Mature, the game show for married couples who want to go the distance, beat the odds, and put the relation back in their relationship and build a loving and lasting godly relationship. What do you say? Want to play?
Absolutely.
When is dinner?
Super. The rules are simple. When you hear this buzzer, you have the opportunity to rephrase a thoughtless comment and make it thoughtful. A chance for a meaningful conversation rather than a meaningless one. Scott, let's start with you. Welcome to round one of That's So Mature.
That's So Mature!
Scott, you began the conversation insinuating that your wife should have been able to pay the bill while she was at work. How can you rephrase that and make it more positive and engaging encounter?
Hi. Sweetheart, why didn't you have time to pay the bill today? What? What's wrong with that?
The answer we were looking for was, how was your day? How was your day?
That's implied, isn't it? Okay, all right. How was your day today, sweetheart?
Super! Excellent work, Scott. Now, Charla, your turn. Answer this question. How was your day?
Well, I went to work this morning, and as I was driving, there was a guy driving next to me in a Honda. No, it wasn't a Honda. It was a Datsun. Wait, no, they don't make Datsuns anymore. You know what? What was the car that your cousin Rip drove? You know, the one that we always said looked like a pregnant ferret? Anyway, he was wearing the same colored shirt you were wearing. So I got to work and I walked in like normal and Diane was sitting at the front. Wait, I wasn't even halfway through my day.
Exactly. No one needs that many details. The question was, how was your day? Not, give me a doctoral thesis on your day. Charla, try that again.
Well, babe, to answer your question, I went to work and I ran some errands. I actually had a lot more errands than I thought I would have, which was not stopping me from having a productive day and included having lunch with my mom.
Super work. Nicely done, Charla.
So, what's for dinner? What? What's wrong with that? What? I'm starving! And it's her night to cook.
Yeah, I'm not really clear on that either. It's breakfast for dinner, by the way.
Awesome. Love it.
First of all, Scott, don't think with your stomach before you think with your heart. Take the time to let her know that you're happy she had a good day.
Isn't that obvious? I mean, why wouldn't I want her to be happy?
Well, sometimes I don't really think you care too much about my day.
Oh, of course I care. I'm sorry. I should tell you more that I care, babe. I got this. Honey, what can I do to help you with dinner tonight?
Nope. That was me. I slipped. I'm sorry.
That was a really brave offer, babe.
I think you mean helpful, not brave.
No, I think she's referring to the fear I have with those biscuits that explode when you open them.
How embarrassing. And that brings us to the lightning round.
That doesn't sound good.
2 negative. Charla, go.
I'm confused.
Excellent, Charla. Good to express your confusion. Scott!
Can I have a biscuit? May I have a biscuit?
This is not English class, Scott.
Do you want a biscuit?
Excellent. Generosity always wins.
High five, babe.
Hello? Isn't there a cash prize or something?
There you go. So apparently we have to talk nicer. All right, so there you go. All right, now Joseph is going to break it off with Mary, and an angel shows up and tells Joseph, do not do that. Look at why. Matthew 1:21. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, all of this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. That's all the way back in Isaiah. So he pulls from Isaiah and he says, this is why you cannot break it off, because you should know this. Now look at, this is what I say, this is Jesus in the Old Testament. Now look at Matthew 2. We're going to talk about Herod for a second. Herod the Great. Herod is this horrible, horrible man. He hears that a Jewish baby boy is born who would be king one day. He knows that, and he's freaked out. And so, he doesn't want any competition. So he comes up with this really evil plan that he's going to go kill all the baby boys in the town where this king is supposedly, going to be born. So he goes to the Jewish, the chief priests and scribes who know their Old Testament, and he asks them this question. Look at verse 4. Herod, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah would be born. Like Herod isn't even Jewish, but he says, you guys should know where the Messiah is going to come from. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. And where you get that is from Micah chapter 2. They knew their scriptures in the Old Testament. Then after Jesus is born, Herod's going to kill all the babies. So God warns Joseph in a dream to go to Egypt, and then we see this in Matthew 2:15. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken of through the Lord, through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son, and that is Hosea 11:1. So you see what I'm saying? If you read through, as you're reading, you're like, oh my gosh, this is Jesus in the Old Testament. And we see it over and over and over. Especially in the book of Matthew. Matthew pointed his audience back to the Old Testament to prove that Jesus is the prophesied coming Messiah. I put this in your handout. It's this whole thing. It shows you all the verses in Matthew, all the places in the Old Testament where you can find that verse, where and then what it's all about. So Jesus is fulfilling Scripture. Now, the last few minutes, what I want to do is I want to talk about this really quick. It's called typology. Mike Winger brought this up. And it's a Truth Be Told channel, YouTube channel. He interviewed Mike Winger on what is typology, because it's all through the Old Testament. It's not just specific things, and you'll see what it means here. So watch this.
So what is typology for our people that don't know what it is?
All right. Well, you guys are familiar with, probably the listeners familiar with different ologies, like theology, whatever. So ology means the study of, and then whatever precedes that is the thing you're studying. And so theology, well, theo means God. So that's the study of God. And typology is the study of types, but that is so vague. It is so not helpful to use that term. Later, you'll start using it a lot, but at first you're like, what are you talking about? So basically a type, to put it crudely, but I think in a way that just clicks, is it's something in the Old Testament that has intentional similarities to something in the New Testament. So it could be a person, a building, an activity. More organically, I could put it this way. God uses real lives, events, and things in the ancient past as a way of telling the story of Jesus ahead of time, so that when you get to the big reveal, you get excited to go back and rewatch the movie, so to speak, to find all these Easter eggs throughout the Old Testament, ways that God has shown and hidden the truth of who Jesus is, so that you'll see the entire Bible speaks of Jesus. A good illustration of this is those movies you have to watch twice. So one example, and whether people have seen it or not, they're at least familiar with it. It became kind of a pop culture thing. The I see dead people moment. At any rate, you watch the movie, and if you've seen it, you find out that Bruce Willis was dead the whole time.
Right.
And that's the big reveal. Now, in the movie, you felt like you watched him interacting with people and doing things. And you're like, but wait a minute, but the dead people in this fantasy story world, they don't do that. But when you rewatch the film, you realize they were very careful all the way along to be consistent, so that you'd be like, how did I not see that? And I think that's what happens with Jesus in the Old Testament. You see Jesus goes, hey, Moses wrote of me, right? In the volume of the book, it's written of me. And then you see the reveal of who Jesus is. You look back at the Old Testament and you're like, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. And it gets very exciting. There's people, there's events, institution, themes. A word other than type in English, a word that might help even more, is the word shadow. And that's what Hebrews 10 verse 1 uses. It says that the law has a shadow of the good things to come that are fulfilled in Jesus. And Jesus is seen as the one who is reflecting the shadow, casting the shadow back at the Old Testament. I like that analogy. I think it's helpful for me. A shadow looks a lot like the person, but it's not the person.
Right.
So look for things in the Old Testament that look like Jesus.
He uses shadow, but I'm going to show you really quick. Here's some typologies in the Bible. They're all over, but just so you know, here's a couple. The Ark, Noah's Ark. Think about this. Why does Noah's Ark only have one door? One door to get in. There's only one way of salvation. So the Ark is a type of salvation. We say the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, that a lamb would be provided, which is exactly what happened. And Jesus is that lamb that's provided for. So you suddenly start seeing these things. Joseph in the Old Testament, remember, his brothers hated him and they sold him to traders. But then Joseph suffered a lot, but then came back and saved his family and rescued them from the famine. And this is kind of like Jesus. Jesus was hated by his family. He was hated by the Jews. And yet he suffered to save them. So you start looking at people going, oh, wait a minute. That sounds a little bit like Jesus. Moses, there's a bunch of stuff all over the Bible about Moses. I just only picked out one of them. Moses willingly left his royal home and high position in Pharaoh's palace for the sake of his people. And then Jesus, the royal Son of God, willingly left the glory of heaven to come to earth for the sake of his people. We see it Jonah in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. This is a type foreshadowing the resurrection of Jesus. You see when Moses and the tabernacle, and they build this whole tabernacle and sacrificial system. If you look at each piece of that in the Old Testament, everything comes and it meshes with Jesus. So that's what he's talking about when you're talking about types, is you're going through the Bible. And I was starting reading Genesis the other day, and all of a sudden I came upon something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I never saw that before. Like, that's a type. And so that's what will start happening once you realize that that's Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, it's all throughout the Old Testament, and North Avenue Church says this: typologies are like rebar, and he does like a 20-second thing on this, so watch this.
He introduces the theme of typology. I'm like, what is that? What is he talking about? And he basically says this: listen, you've got to understand that Jesus doesn't just fulfill specific prophecies in the Old Testament, like the Messiah will come riding a donkey into Jerusalem in Zechariah. That's just a specific prophecy of the Messiah. Okay, so there are some verses that are just, it's just Jesus is the only answer to that question. But he says, no, there are other things that Jesus fulfills. And this is what he says. Jesus doesn't just fulfill a half dozen specific prophecies. No, he fulfills trajectories that run through the Old Testament. These are themes, institutions, roles, things that run through like almost like rebar through concrete. They run through the Old Testament structure and they culminate in Jesus.
I love that. It runs through all of the Old Testament and it culminates in Jesus. So what typology does is it fits these two puzzle pieces, the New Testament and the Old Testament, together. And so I want to just end by saying this. If you don't think the Bible's true, you might want to rethink it. I mean, now that we've showed you all of this stuff about how Jesus is in the Old Testament before he even showed up on this earth, then it says to me, something is amazing about the Bible. Like, here is a book that's inspired by God, written over 1,500 years, 40 different authors, like in 3 continents, 3 different languages, and yet when you see it from Genesis to Revelation, you go, oh my gosh, it is one big story. How does that happen? And I don't know how it would happen unless it was a miraculous book inspired by God. And if that is true, then we need to understand, just like the ark, that Jesus says he is the only way to a relationship with God. That's it. I always like to end by just saying, John Rich made it very clear that Jesus is coming back to this earth. And Revelation is coming like a dark train running. And the only answer is Jesus. And if you don't know him, I beg you today to make that happen. Next week, we're going to see places in the Old Testament where Jesus steps out of heaven, shows up, God himself. He's known as the angel of the Lord. So we're going to tell you why that is. And let's pray. Thank you, God, for your word. Thank you for how it's so fascinating and amazing and miraculous how this whole Bible comes together. We're so grateful that you made glimpses of Jesus in the Old Testament so we can pull it all together and recognize that Jesus is really who he is, the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Son that's here to save us. So I thank you for that. Thank you for his life, his death, his resurrection to prove that. I pray if anyone doesn't know him, that your Spirit would speak to their hearts today. Thank you for these women who show up. Bless them this week in Jesus' name. Amen.